Well, there were still loose ends to tie. Still business to settle. I took a skeleton crew to Bristol, a few of my most trusted men. We sailed the Atlantic, a hard, rough crossing, made bearable by a stay in the Azores, then continued our journey to the British Isles and to Bristol. To home. To a place I hadn't visited for nigh on a decade. A place I'd been warned against ever returning to. As we came into the Bristol Channel, the black flag of the Jackdaw was brought down, folded up and placed carefully in a chest in my cabin. In its place we raised the red ensign. It would be enough to allow us to land at least, and once the port-marshals had worked out the Jackdaw was not a naval vessel, I'd be ashore and the ship anchored offshore. And then I saw it for the first time in so long, the Bristol dock, and I caught my breath. I'd loved Kingston, Havana, and above all Nassau. But despite everything that had happened, or maybe because of it, this was still my home. Heads turned in my direction as I strode along the harbour, a figure of mystery, dressed not like a pirate but something else. Perhaps some of the older ones remembered me, merchants I'd done business with as a sheep farmer, men I'd drunk with in the taverns when I boasted of going off to sea, and tongues would wag, and news would travel far. How far, I wondered? To Matthew Haig and Wilson? To Emmett Scott? Would they know that Edward Kenway was back, stronger and more powerful than before, and that he had scores to settle? I found a boarding house in town, and there rested the night. The next morning I bartered for a horse and saddle, and set off for Hatherton, riding until I reached my father's old farmhouse. Why I went there I'm not quite sure. I think I just wanted to see it. And so for long moments that's what I did. I stood by the gate in the shade of a tree, and contemplated my old home. It had been rebuilt, of course, and was only partly recognisable as the house in which I'd grown up. The one thing that had remained the same was the outhouse. The outhouse where my marriage to Caroline had begun. The outhouse in which you were conceived, Jennifer. I left, then halfway between Hatherton and Bristol, a road I knew so well, I stopped at a place I also knew well. The old Shillelagh. I tethered my horse outside, made sure she had water, then stepped in to find it almost exactly as I remembered. The low ceilings, the darkness that seemed to seep from the walls. The last time I was here I'd killed a man. My first man. Many more had fallen beneath my blade since. More to come. Behind the bar was a woman in her 50s, and she raised her tired head to look at me as I approached. "Hello, Mother," I said. 68. She took me to a side table away from the prying eyes of the few drinkers there. "So it's true, then?" she asked me. Her long hair had grey streaks in it. Her face was drawn and tired. It was only 10 years since I'd last seen her, but it was as though she had aged 20, 30, more. All my fault. "What's true, Mother?" I asked carefully. "You're a pirate." "No, Mother, I'm not a pirate. No longer. I've joined an order." "You're a monk?" She cast an eye over my robes. "No, Mother, I'm not a monk. Something else." She sighed, looking unimpressed. Over at the bar, the landlord was toweling tankards, watching us with a hawk eye. He begrudged her the time she spent away from the bar, but wasn't about to say anything. Not with the pirate Edward Kenway around. "And you decided to come back, did you?" she was saying. "I heard that you had. That you sailed into port yesterday, stepped off a glittering galleon like some kind of king. The big I am, Edward Kenway. That's what you always wanted, wasn't it?" "Mother." "That was what you were always going on about, wasn't it? Wanting to go off and make your fortune, make something of yourself, become a man of quality, wasn't it? That involved becoming a pirate, did it?" She sneered. I didn't think I'd ever seen my mother sneer before. You were lucky they didn't hang you. They still might if they catch me. It's not like that anymore. I've come to make things right. She pulled a face like she'd tasted something nasty, another expression I'd never seen before. Oh, yes, and how'd you plan to do that? I waved a hand. Not have you working here for a start. I'll work wherever I like, young man, she scoffed. You needn't think you're paying me off with stolen gold. Gold that belonged to other folks before they were forced to hand it to you at the point of your sword, eh? Is that it? It's not like that, Ma, I whispered, feeling young all of a sudden. Not like the pirate Edward Kenway at all. This wasn't how I'd imagined it would be. Tears, embraces, apologies, promises. Not like this. I leaned forward. I don't want it to be like this, Ma, I said quietly. She smirked. That was always your trouble, wasn't it, Edward? Never happy with what you got. No, I began, exasperated. I know what you mean. You mean you made a mess of things and then you left us to clear up your mess. And now you've got some finery about you and a bit of money. You think you can come back and pay me off. You're no better than Haig and Scott and their cronies. No, it's not like that. I heard you arrived with a little girl in tow. Your daughter? Yes. She pursed her lips and nodded, a little sympathy creeping into her eyes. It was her who told you about Caroline, was it? My fists clenched. She did. She told you that Caroline was sick with the pox, and that her father refused her medicine, and that she ended up wasting away at that house on Hawkins Lane? She told you that, did she? She told me that, Ma, yes. She scratched at her head and looked away. I loved that girl. Caroline. Really loved her. Like a daughter she was to me until she went away. She shot me a reproachful look. That was your fault. I went to the funeral, just to pay my respects, just to stand at the gate. But Scott was there, and all his cronies, Matthew Haig and that Wilson fella. They ran me off the place, said I wasn't welcome. They'll pay for that, Ma, I said through clenched teeth. They'll pay for what they've done. She looked quickly at me. Oh, yes. How are they going to pay then, Edward? Tell me that. You're going to kill them, are you? With your sword? Your pistols? Word is, they've gone into hiding, the men you seek. Ma, how many men have died at your hand, eh? She asked. I looked at her. The answer, of course, was countless. She was shaking, I noticed, with fury. You think that makes you a man, don't you? She said. And I knew her words were about to hurt more than any blade. But do you know how many men your father killed, Edward? None. Not one. And he was twice the man you are. I winced. Don't be like this. I know I could have done things differently. I wish I'd done things differently. But I'm back now. Back to sort out the mess I made. She was shaking her head. No, you don't understand, Edward. There is no mess anymore. The mess needed sorting out when you left. The mess needed sorting out when your father and I cleared up what remained of our home and tried to start again. It put years on him, Edward. Years. The mess needed sorting out when nobody would trade with us. Not a letter from you. Not a word. Your daughter was born, your father died, and not a peep from the great explorer. You don't understand. They threatened me. They threatened you. They said if I ever returned, they'd hurt you. She pointed. You did more hurting than they ever could, my son. And now you're here to stir things up again, are you? Things have got to be put right. She stood. Not in my name, they don't. I'll have nothing to do with you. She raised her voice to address everybody in the tavern. Only a few would hear her, but word would soon spread. You hear that? She said loudly. I disown him. The great and famous pirate Edward Kenway. He's nothing to do with me. Hands flat on a tabletop, she leaned forward and hissed, Now get out, no son of mine. Get out before I tell the soldiers where the pirate Edward Kenway is to be found. I left, and when on the journey back to my boarding house in Bristol I realised that my cheeks were wet. I allowed myself to cry. Grateful for one thing. Grateful that there was nobody around to see my tears or hear my wails of grief. 69. So, they'd gone to ground, the guilty men. And yes, there had been others there that night, the Cobleys among them. But I had no desire to account for them all, little taste for taking the lives of men given orders. The men I wanted gave those orders. Haig, Scott, and of course the man who left the insignia of the Templars on my face all those years ago. Wilson. Men who hid from me, whose guilt was confirmed by the fact that they were hiding from me. Good. Let them hide. Let them shake with fear. They knew I was coming after them. And I was coming after them. Tonight, all being well, Scott, Wilson, and Haig would be dead. But they knew I was coming, so my investigations would have to be conducted a little more discreetly. When I left my boarding house the next morning, I did so knowing I was beneath the gaze of Templar spies. I ducked into a tavern I knew of old. Better than my pursuers, no doubt, and thanked my lucky stars it still had the same rear privy it always had. By the back door I held my breath against the stink, quickly stripped off my robes and changed into clothes I'd brought with me from the jackdaw. Clothes I'd last worn many, many moons ago. My long buttoned-up waistcoat, knee breeches, white stockings, and a battered brown tricorn. And thus attired, I left the tavern, emerging on a different street, a different person. Just another merchant on his way to market. I found her there, exactly where I'd expected to, and jogged the basket on her arm so she'd know I was behind her, whispering. I got your message. Good, said Rose, without turning her head, bending to inspect some flowers. With a quick look left and right, she whipped out a headscarf and tied it over her head. Follow me. A moment later, Rose and I loitered near some dilapidated stables in a deserted corner of the market. I glanced at the structure, then back again with a jolt of recognition. I'd stabled my own horse here many years ago. It had been new then and convenient for the market, but the sprawl of stalls had shifted over the intervening years, its entrances had moved, and the stables had fallen into disuse, fit only for loitering near, for conducting clandestine meetings, as we did now. You've met young Jennifer, have you? She said. She shifted the basket on her arm. She'd been a young girl when I'd first encountered her at the old Shillelagh. 10 years later she was still young, but missing was that spark, that rebellious streak that had made her run away in the first place. A decade of drudgery had done that to her. And yet, like the glowing sparks of a dying fire, there was some of her old nature left, because she'd sent me a letter requesting to meet me, and here she was, with things to tell me. Among them, I hoped, the whereabouts of her master and his friends. I have, I told her. I've met my daughter. She's safe on my ship. She has your eyes. I nodded. She has her mother's beauty. She's a beautiful girl. We were all very fond of her. But willful. Rose smiled. Oh, yes. She was determined that she should see you when Mistress Caroline passed away last year. I'm surprised Emmett allowed it. Rose chortled dryly. He didn't, sir. It was the mistress of the house who organised it. Her and Miss Jennifer cooked it up between them. The first his nibs knew of it was when he woke up to find Miss Jennifer gone. He wasn't happy. He wasn't happy at all, sir. Meetings, were there? She looked at me. You could say that, sir, yes. Who came to see him, Rose? Master Haig. And Wilson? She nodded her head. All the conspirators. And where are they now? I don't rightly know, sir, she said. I sighed. Then why invite me here if you've nothing to tell me? She turned her face to me. I mean, I don't know where they're hiding, sir, but I do know where Mr. Scott plans to be tonight, for I've been asked to take him some fresh clothes to his offices. The warehouse? Yes, sir. He has business items to collect as well, sir. He plans to be there personally. I've been asked to go there when night has fallen. I looked at her long and hard. Why, Rose? I said. Why are you helping me like this? She glanced this way and that. Because you once helped save me from a fate worse than death. Because Mistress Caroline loved you. And because... What? Because that man, he watched her die. He wouldn't let her get the medicine she needed. Not her or Mrs. Scott, the both of them ill. Mrs. Scott recovered, but Mrs. Kenway never did. It startled me to hear Caroline called Mrs. Kenway. It had been so long since she'd been referred to that way. Why did he deny them the medicine? Pride, sir. It was him who caught the smallpox first, but he recovered. He thought Mrs. Scott and Mrs. Kenway should be able to as well. But she began to get such terrible blisters all over her face, sir. Oh, sir, you've never seen anything like it. I held up a hand, not wanting to hear more, wanting to preserve the image I had of Caroline. There was an epidemic in London, and we think Mr. Scott picked it up there. Even the royal family were in fear of it. You didn't get it? She looked at me guiltily. The staff were inoculated, sir. Head butler saw to it. Swore us to silence. I sighed. Good for him. He may have saved you a great deal of suffering. Sir. I looked at her. Tonight, then? Tonight, sir. Yes. 70. And it had to be tonight. Are you Edward Kenway? She'd said to me. My landlady. Edith was her name. She'd knocked on the door to my room and stood on the threshold, unwilling to venture further. Her face was bloodless, her voice shook, and her fingers worried at the hem of her pinafore. Edward Kenway? I smiled. Now why would you say a thing like that, Edith? She cleared her throat. They say that a man arrived on a boat. A man dressed much like you are now, sir. And that the man is Edward Kenway, who once called Bristol his home. The colour had come back into her cheeks now, and she reddened, continuing. And there are others who say that Edward Kenway has returned home to settle scores, and that those against whom he bears his grudge have gone into hiding, but being powerful men have called resources against you. I mean, him. I see, I said carefully. And what manner of resources might these be? A troop of soldiers headed for Bristol, sir, expected to arrive this very evening. I see. And no doubt heading straight for wherever this Edward Kenway has his lodgings, whereupon Edward Kenway would be forced to defend himself, and there would surely be a bloody battle, with many lives lost and much damage caused. She swallowed. Yes, sir. Well, you can rest assured, Edith, that no such unpleasantness will occur here tonight. For I'm sure Edward Kenway will make certain of it. And know this of him, Edith. It's true he was a pirate once, and that he did his fair share of despicable things. But he's chosen a different path now. He knows that to see differently we must think differently. And he has changed his thinking. She looked at me blankly. Very good, sir. And now I shall take my leave, I told her. Doubtless never to return. Very good, sir. On the bed was a bundle of my things that I picked up and slung over one shoulder. Then I thought better of it and instead picked out what I needed. a skull, and a small pouch of coins that I opened, pressing gold into Edith's hand. "Oh, sir, that's more than generous." "You've been very kind, Edith," I said. She stood to one side. "There's a back door, sir," she said. I went via a tavern where I knew to find the jackdaw's coxswain, awaiting my orders. "Birtwistle?" "Yes, sir." "Bring the jackdaw to the harbour tonight. We're leaving." "Yes, sir." And then I went on to the warehouse district, using the back streets and rooftops. I stayed low and in the shadows. And I thought, oh, Mary, if you could only see me now. Scott's warehouse was one of many near the ports, the masts of berthed ships visible over the roofs. Most of the warehouses were deserted, shut up for the night. Only his had signs of life. Flaming cressets that painted a small loading area a shade of flickering orange, empty carts nearby, and standing by the closed door a pair of guards. Not soldiers, at least. Had they arrived in the city yet? But local scar-faces, slapping clubs into their palms, who probably thought this was an easy job, who were probably looking forward to a taste of ale later. I stayed where I was, a shadow in the darkness, watching the door. Was he already in there? I was still debating when to make my move when Rose arrived. She wore the same headscarf as earlier, and her basket bulged with clothes for her hated lord and master, Emmett Scott. The two strong arms at the door shared a lascivious look as they stepped forward to intercept her. Sticking to the side of the adjacent warehouse, I crept within earshot. "Is Mr. Scott here?" she asked.
"Ah,"
said one of the scar-faces in a heavy West Country accent, grinning.
"Well, that all depends on who's asking, don't it, my dear?"
"I've clothes for him."
"You'd be the maid, would you?"
"That's right."
"Well, he's here, so you'd better go in."
I was close enough to see her roll her eyes as they stepped aside and let her in. Right. So Scott was in there. In the dark, I tested the action of my blade. Mustn't be too hasty, I thought. Mustn't kill him. Scott had some talking to do before he died. I moved round the edge of the warehouse wall, and the two strong arms were just a few feet away from me now. It was just a question of waiting for the right moment to From inside came a scream. Rose. And it was no longer a question of waiting for the right time. It was a time for action. I'd sprung from the dark, covered the distance between myself and the sentries, engaged the blade, and slashed the throat of the first one, before Rose's scream had even died down. The second one cursed and swung his club, but I caught his flailing arm, jammed him up against the warehouse wall, and finished him with a blade in his back. He slid down the wall even as I crouched at the wicket door of the warehouse, raised a hand, and pushed it open. A musket ball zinged over my head as I rolled into the entranceway, getting a quick impression of a warehouse stacked with tea chests, a gantry with offices on it at one end. There were 3 figures on the gantry, one of them standing on the rail as though about to jump the 20 feet or so to the ground. I came to rest behind a stack of crates, peeked round the edge, and pulled back as another ball smacked into the wood nearby, showering me with wood chips. But my quick look was enough to confirm that, yes, there were 3 people on the gantry above me. There was Wilson, who stood with a pistol aimed at my hiding place. To one side of him was Emmett Scott, sweating as with trembling, frantic fingers he tried to reload another pistol to hand to Wilson. And above them was Rose, who wobbled unsteadily on the railing, terrified. Her mouth bled, the punishment for her warning scream, no doubt. Her hands had been tied, and she wore a noose round her neck. All that stopped her from dropping from her makeshift gallows was Wilson, who held her with his other hand. If he let go, she fell.
"Hold it there, Kenway,"
called Wilson as the dust settled,
"or you'll have the death of the maid on your hands."
They'd disarm me. They'd kill me, then hang Rose for her treachery. Not if I have anything to do with it. From my gun belt I pulled a pistol and checked the ball and powder. "It was you there that night, wasn't it, Wilson? The leader. You were the one in the hood." I had to know. I had to be sure. "Aye, it was. And if it had been left up to me, you would all have died that night." I almost smiled. You missed your chance. Up on the rail, Rose whimpered but checked herself. "Now throw out the hidden blade, Kenway. I can't hold her forever," warned Wilson. "And what about you, Emmett?" I called. "Were you there?" "I was not," he retorted, flustered and frightened. "You would have celebrated my death, though. You have been a thorn in my side, Kenway. Your pride has been your undoing, Scott. Your pride has been the undoing of us all. You know nothing. I know that you allowed my beloved to die. I loved her too. No kind of love that I recognize, Scott. You wouldn't understand. I understand that your ambition and thirst for power have led to the deaths of many people. I understand that now you will pay." From inside my robes I took a throwing knife and weighed it in my palm. Bit different to using trees for target practice. I stood and inched towards the edge of the stack, taking deep, slow breaths. Ready? Ready. "Come on, Kenway," called Wilson. "We don't have all I rolled out from my cover and darted forward and found my aim, firing my pistol and using the throwing knife at the same time. Both met their targets. Emmett Scott span away with a hole in his forehead, his pistol dropping uselessly to the planks of the gantry, while Wilson had returned fire before my knife found his shoulder. Yelling in pain, he staggered back and fell against the office wall with the blade embedded, fountaining blood, as he scrabbled in vain for the second pistol. His ball had found its mark. I felt it thud into my shoulder, but couldn't let it take me down. Couldn't even let it slow me down, because Wilson had let go of Rose, and Rose was falling, her mouth wide in a scream I didn't hear above the echoes of the gunshots and the rushing of pain in my head. She fell, and the rope unspooled behind her, and I had an image of failure where the rope tautened and her body jerked and her neck snapped. No. I hit a crate at full pelt, stepped up in a run and launched myself off. I twisted, engaged my blade, and with a yell of effort sliced the rope, caught Rose round the waist, and the pair of us slammed heavily and painfully to the stone floor of the warehouse. But alive. From above I heard Wilson cursing. I snatched a second pistol from my belt and squinted through the gaps in the boards above me, seeing the light flicker and squeezing off a shot. There came another scream from the gantry, then a crash as he made his way into the offices. I dragged myself to my feet. The pain from my wound was intense, and the older wound in my flank flared up too, making me limp as I made it to the steps of the gantry and climbed in pursuit of Wilson. I charged through the office where I found an open back door leading to steps, and at the top I caught my breath and leaned on the rail for support as I peered over the warehouses. No sign. Just the distant clattering of ships at rest and the squawk of gulls. I concentrated, using the sense, and I heard something. But not Wilson. What I heard was the sound of marching feet as they approached the port area. They were coming. The soldiers were coming. I cursed and limped back inside to check on Rose. She would be okay. I ran back to follow a trail of blood left by Wilson. 71. You were safe in my cabin. Asleep, so I'm told. So you missed what happened next. And for that I'm thankful. I reached the harbour to find that Wilson had died on the way. His body lay at the bottom of the steps. He'd been going to a ship I recognised. One that when I'd last seen it was called the Caroline, but had since been renamed in honour of the woman Matthew Haig had gone on to marry. It was called the Charlotte. Haig was in there. A man awaiting death, though he didn't know it yet. I could see poorly defined figures in the grey haze of the evening moving across the stern gunwale. Guards. But it didn't matter. Nothing was going to stop me getting on board that ship. If the guards had seen or heard Wilson fall, they probably thought he was drunk. And if they saw me squatting by his body, then they probably thought I was a drunk too. They didn't care. Not yet. I counted 4 of them as I raced along the harbour wall until I reached where the jackdaw had not long been docked. In between the 2 ships was another smaller sailing boat, held by a line that I unwound and let go, giving the stern of the craft a shove to set it off before dashing back to my ship. "Hanley," I said, addressing the quartermaster. "Yes, sir." "Prepare the guns." He'd been sitting with his feet up on the navigation table, but dragged them off. "What? Why, sir?" "And bloody hell, sir, what's up with you?" "Musket ball in the shoulder." "Did you get the men you wanted?" "2 of them." "I'll fetch the dock." "Leave it, Hanley," I growled. "It can wait. Look, there's a vessel to our starboard, name of Charlotte. On it is the 3rd man I seek. Ready the starboard guns, and if my plans fail, blast her out of the water." I ran to the cabin door, then stopped, screwing up my face in pain as I turned to him. "And Hanley?" "Yes, sir?" He had stood, his face a picture of worry. "You'd better prepare the stern guns as well. And make sure the crew is armed. There are soldiers on the way." "Sir?" I gave him an apologetic look. "Just look sharp, Hanley. If all goes well, we'll be out of this in moments." He didn't look reassured. He looked even more worried. I gave him what I hoped was a confident smile, then swept a wedge from beneath the cabin door as I left. The sailing boat had begun its drift out to sea. I heard a shout from the deck of the Charlotte as they spotted it. The laughter. Fools. They saw the joke, not the danger. I leapt overboard, planting my feet on the stone of the harbour, then racing the few yards to the stern of the Charlotte. "It's Wilson!" I shouted, in my best approximation of the dead enforcer, as I clambered up the ladder. A face appeared over the gunwale to greet me, and I planted my fist in it, dragged him over the rail, and hurled him to the stone below. His screams alerted a second man who came running to what he assumed was the scene of an accident, until he saw me and the blade, which gleamed in the moonlight before I swept it backhanded across his throat. Ignoring the last 2 sentries, I ran up the deck towards the captain's cabin, peered through the window, and was treated to the sight of Matthew Haig, an older Matthew Haig, and a worried one by the looks of things, standing by a table. With him was his draftsman. With a glance to see the 2 sentries lumbering up the deck towards me, I dragged open the door of the cabin. "You," I said to the draftsman. Haig dropped a goblet he'd been holding. They both goggled at me. I risked another glance back at the sentries. I cursed, slammed the cabin door shut, wedged it, and turned to meet the 2 guards. They could have escaped, I told myself, as they died. It was their choice to fight me. To my port, the hatches of the Jackdaw's gun deck were opening, and the muzzles of guns appeared. Good lads. I saw men on deck brandishing muskets and swords. Somebody shouted, "You need a hand, Captain?" No, I didn't. I turned back to the cabin door, pulled the wedge free, and snatched open the door. "Right. Last chance," I ordered the draftsman, who practically threw himself at me. "Archer!" wailed Haig. But neither of us was listening as I hauled Archer out of the cabin and jammed it shut behind him. Haig imprisoned now. "Get off the ship," I barked to Archer, who needed no further invitation, scrabbling for the stern. Now I could hear the marching feet of soldiers as they approached the harbour wall. "Tar!" I appealed to my crew on the other deck. "Barrels of tar, and be quick about it!" A barrel was tossed to me from the jackdaw, and I set upon it, opening it and spreading it by the door to the cabin. "Please!" I could hear Haig from inside. He was thumping on the wedged-shut door. "Please!" But I was deaf to him. The marching was closer now. Horse hooves, the rumble of cartwheels. I glanced at the harbour wall, expecting to see the tops of their bayonets as I emptied a second barrel of tar on the deck. Would it be enough? It would have to do. And now I saw them. The muskets of the soldiers as they appeared, silhouetted along the top of the harbour wall. At the same time they saw me and pulled the muskets from their shoulders and took aim. By my side, the crew of the Jackdaw did the same, as I snatched up a torch and leapt to the ratlines, climbing to a point where I could let go of the torch, dive off the rigging, and escape the flames. If the muskets didn't get me first, that was. And then came the command. "Hold your fire!" 72. The order came from a carriage that had pulled up on the harbour, its door opening before it had even finished drawing to a halt. Out skipped two men, one dressed like a footman, who arranged the steps for the second man, a tall, lean gentleman who wore smart clothes. And now a third man appeared, a portly gentleman in a long white wig, frilled shirt, and fine satin jacket and breeches. A man who looked as though he'd enjoyed many a lunch in his time, and many a glass of port and brandy to go with those many lunches. The footman and the tall man gaped as they became aware of the many guns pointing in their direction. By accident or design, they placed themselves in the middle. The guns of the soldiers on one side, the carriage guns and muskets of the Jackdaw on the other, and me on the rigging, ready to drop a flaming torch to the deck below. The portly gentleman moved his mouth as though exercising it in readiness to speak. He laced his hands across his chest, rocked back on his heels, and called up to me. "Do I have the pleasure of addressing Captain Edward Kenway?" "And who might you be?" I called back. That produced a shudder of amusement from the soldiers on the harbour wall. The portly man smiled. "You've been away a long time, Captain Kenway." I agreed I had. His lips smacked and rearranged themselves into a smile. "Then you are forgiven for not knowing who I am. I think, however, that you will know my name. It is Walpole. Sir Robert Walpole. I am the First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Leader of the House of Commons." And I was just thinking what an impressive title that was, and how he must be one of the most powerful men in the land, when... Walpole? It couldn't be. But he was nodding. "Yes, indeed, Captain Kenway. Duncan Walpole, the man whose life and identity you took as your own, was my cousin." I felt myself tense even more. What game was he playing? And who was the tall man by his side? It struck me that he had a family resemblance to Matthew Haig. Was this his father, Sir Aubrey Haig? Walpole was waving a reassuring hand. "It is quite all right. Not only was my cousin involved in affairs I keep at a distance, but he was a treacherous man. A man blessed, I'm afraid, with few principles. A man prepared to sell the secrets of those who trusted him to the highest bidder. I was ashamed to see him bear the Walpole name. I think perhaps in many ways you have done my family a good turn." "I see," I called. "And that's why you're here, is it? To thank me for killing your cousin?" "Oh, no, not at all." "Then to what do I owe the pleasure of this visit? As you can see, I have other matters to attend to." The torch grumbled as I waved it for effect. From the wedged cabin of the Charlotte came a banging sound as Haig tried to get free. Otherwise there was a tense hush as the soldiers and the sailors peered at one another along the barrels of their weapons, both sets of men awaiting their orders. "Well, Captain Kenway, it's exactly those matters that exercise us, I'm afraid. called Walpole. "For I cannot allow you to continue on your present course of action. As a matter of fact, I'm going to have to ask you to toss the torch in the sea and come down from there right away. Or, alas, I shall have the men shoot you." I chortled. "You shoot me, and my men return fire, Sir Robert. I fear even you yourself might get caught in the crossfire. Not to mention your friend, Sir Aubrey Haig, is it?" "It is indeed, sir," said the tall man, stepping forward. "I come to plead clemency for my son." His son had been a disappointment to him, I could see. "Let me see your fingers," I demanded. Haig raised his hands. A Templar ring glittered. My heart hardened. "And you, Sir Robert?" His hands remained laced across his stomach. "You'll see no ring on me, Captain Kenway." "Why does the idea tickle you? From what I've seen, the Templars enjoy rank and status. How am I to know that I'm not addressing their Grand Master?" He smiled. "Because no power is absolute, Captain Kenway, and my purpose here is not to act as ambassador for one side or indeed the other. My purpose here is to prevent an act of barbarism." I scoffed. Barbarism? It didn't seem to bother them when they were burning my parents' home. Where was Sir Robert Walpole then? Sipping port, perhaps, with his Templar friends, congratulating himself on abstaining from their schemes. He could afford to, of course. His wealth and power were already assured. From the cabin, Matthew Haig snivelled and whimpered. "You have returned to these shores on a mission of vengeance, I take it," called Walpole. "There are those with whom I have scores to settle, yes?" Walpole nodded. "Woodes Rogers being one of them." I gave a short, surprised laugh. "Yes, he would be one of them." "Would it make a difference if I told you that Rogers currently languishes in debtor's prison? That the wounds you inflicted on him have left his health in a terrible state of disrepair? That his order has disowned him? His hot temper, his continued slave trading? He is a broken man, Captain Kenway. I wonder if perhaps you might consider that matter settled." He was right. What more harm could my blade do to Rogers other than to put him out of his misery? "He is not my immediate concern," I called. "That honour belongs to the man in the cabin below." Walpole gave a sad smile. "A silly, shallow boy, influenced by others. You must believe me when I tell you, Captain Kenway, that the principal malefactors in that particular episode are already dead by your hands. Rest assured that Matthew's current shame is punishment enough for his wrongdoing." I took a deep breath. I thought of my mother asking me how many I'd killed. I thought of Black Bart's cruelty. I thought of Mary Reed's spirit and Adewale's courage and Blackbeard's generosity. And I thought of you. Because Torres had been wrong when he said I had nobody. I did have somebody. I had you. You who shone with hope. "Today I should like to make you an offer, Captain Kenway," continued Walpole. "An offer I hope you will find favourable, that will finally draw a curtain across this whole sorry affair." He outlined his proposals. I listened, and when he was finished, I told him my answer, and dropped the torch. 73. Except, of course, I dropped it into the sea. Because he offered pardons for my men and I saw their faces turn expectantly to me. Every one of them a wanted man with a chance of having his slate wiped clean. He offered us all, every man jack of us, a new life. And Walpole had offered much more besides. Property. the chance to make something of myself with business contacts in London. When I'd finally climbed down from the rigging, the soldiers had put down their muskets, and the crew of the Jackdaw relaxed. Then Matthew Haig had been released and run to his father and offered me tearful apologies, while Walpole took my arm and led me away, speaking of who I would be introduced to in London. The Stevenson Oakley family, a lawyer, an assistant by the name of Birch to help me in my new business dealings. My mercy would be handsomely rewarded, he assured me. In return, he would see to it that I became the man I had always wanted to be. A man of quality. Of course, I had since gained greater expectations of myself. But money, business, and a house in London would be a fine foundation on which to build a new and richer life. A fine foundation indeed. A place I could use to attend to my other business. My assassin business.